At 12:14 a.m. on September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat in a bunker 62 miles south of Moscow, watching computer screens flash red. 44 years old, 12 years with the Soviet Air Defense Forces, on-duty commander at the top-secret Serpukhov 15 Nuclear Early Warning Center. The computers showed 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles inbound. He had seconds to decide. Soviet military protocol was absolute. If notification came from the early warning system that missiles had been detected, the response was mandatory. Immediate nuclear counterattack, launch on warning, mutual assured destruction. He was supposed to pick up the phone, call his superiors at Soviet military command, set in motion a nuclear response that would kill hundreds of millions. He didn't. 3 weeks earlier, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 over the Sea of Japan. All 269 passengers and crew dead. The world was screaming at Moscow. American President Ronald Reagan had called the USSR an evil empire 6 months before. NATO was deploying new nuclear missiles across Western Europe. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov was dying. Paranoid, convinced the Americans were planning a first strike. The Oko satellite system, the Eye, had just gone operational. Brand new technology, 9 satellites in Molniya orbits watching American missile fields, designed to spot the infrared signature of ICBM launches, supposed to give the USSR the 20 minutes needed to launch their own missiles before American warheads arrived. The system showed 1 missile, then 4 more. The bunker's alarms were screaming. Officers shouting. Protocol was clear. Petrov had 8 minutes before those missiles, if real, would begin detonating over Soviet cities. He looked at the data. 5 missiles, only 5, and something felt wrong. The United States had thousands of nuclear warheads. If America really launched a first strike, it wouldn't be 5 missiles. It would be hundreds. A massive, overwhelming attack designed to destroy Soviet command and control before retaliation was possible. 5 missiles made no tactical sense. The ground-based radar showed nothing. The satellites saw the launches. The radar saw empty sky. Petrov's training said believe the satellites, but his instinct said the satellites were lying. If he called it in, Soviet doctrine required immediate response. Strategic rocket forces would launch. Thousands of warheads toward American cities. NATO would detect the Soviet launch within minutes, fire their own missiles. Within an hour, nuclear winter would begin. If he was wrong, if those missiles were real, 5 American warheads would detonate over Soviet territory. Millions dead, and the USSR wouldn't know until impact because he didn't report it. He had no orders covering this scenario. Make the wrong call, face court-martial, maybe a firing squad. Make the right call, save the world. Nobody would ever know. Petrov later admitted he was only 50-50 on whether the alarm was real. A coin flip. The fate of human civilization balanced on gut instinct in a concrete bunker beneath Moscow. He picked up the phone and told his superiors it was a false alarm. If you want to understand how close the world came to ending that night, and how one officer's decision saved everything, stay with me. This story gets darker, because the world almost ended twice in 1983. And the second time was even closer. September 26, 1983, wasn't random. It was the most dangerous day of the most dangerous autumn of the Cold War. To understand why Petrov's decision mattered, you need to understand just how close the superpowers were to nuclear war. The year started badly. March 8, 1983. Reagan gave his Evil Empire speech, calling the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world. Soviet leadership took it as confirmation America was preparing for war. March 23, 1983. Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system. The Soviets saw it as preparation for a first strike. If America could shoot down Soviet missiles, deterrence collapsed. The temptation to strike first became overwhelming. May 1983, the KGB initiated Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence effort to detect American preparations for nuclear war. Soviet spies worldwide watched for signs. Blood banks stockpiling, military leaves canceled, NATO readiness increased. The paranoia at the top of Soviet command was absolute. Then came September. September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 flying from Anchorage to Seoul, strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. Navigation error. The crew didn't know. Soviet air defenses did. Fighter jets scrambled. They identified the plane as a Boeing 747, civilian aircraft. But it was in restricted military airspace, flying over sensitive bases. In the paranoia of 1983, Soviet command decided it was a spy plane. At 6:26 a.m., a Soviet Su-15 interceptor fired 2 missiles. The 747 disintegrated. All 269 people aboard died, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. The world exploded in outrage. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets insisted they'd followed procedure. Relations between the superpowers hit their lowest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet leadership became convinced America would use the international outrage as cover for military action. The KGB reported signs everywhere, none of them real, that NATO was preparing for war. 3 weeks later, Stanislav Petrov reported for his shift at Serpukhov 15. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was covering for a colleague. Wrong place, wrong place, wrong time, or exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was born September 7, 1939, near Vladivostok. His father, Yevgraf, flew fighter planes in World War II. His mother was a nurse, military family, Soviet patriot. Young Stanislav wanted to be a musician, or perhaps an artist. He had sensibilities his parents didn't understand. But in the Soviet system, choices were limited. His parents enrolled him in the Kiev Military Aviation Engineering Academy of the Soviet Air Forces. He graduated in 1972, joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Quiet, competent, not ambitious. He did his job. By 1983, he was a lieutenant colonel assigned to the OCO early warning system. The technology was new, complex. Most officers didn't understand it. Petrov did. He'd helped develop the protocols. He knew the system's capabilities and its limitations. The OCO satellites watched for infrared signatures, the bright plume of rocket exhaust during an ICBM launch, space-based sensors staring down at American missile silos. The moment a launch happened, the satellites would see it, send the signal back to Serpukhov 15, give Soviet command 20 to 25 minutes to respond before warheads arrived. But the system was new, barely operational. There were glitches, false readings. Petrov knew that. Most officers didn't. Serpukhov 15 was the nerve center, a concrete bunker housing the command post for Soviet early warning satellites. Inside, banks of computers, radar displays, communication equipment. Officers monitoring screens 24 hours a day. When the alarm sounded, protocol was automatic. Report up the chain immediately. No questions. No hesitation. That night, Petrov was duty officer, in charge of the entire watch. If something happened, he was responsible for the call. At 12:14 a.m. Moscow time, still September 25th in America, the computers registered a launch. OCO satellite number 7, stationed over the continental United States, detected an infrared signature consistent with an ICBM lifting off. One missile, heading toward the Soviet Union. Petrov watched the display. The system tracked the missile's trajectory. Time to impact, approximately 22 minutes. Then the system registered a second launch. Then a third, fourth, fifth. 5 missiles total, all heading for Soviet territory. The bunker erupted. Alarms screaming. Officers shouting. The communications officer grabbed the phone to call Soviet military command. Petrov stopped him. He stared at the screens. 5 missiles. The satellites tracked them clearly. Infrared signatures unmistakable, launch locations confirmed, trajectories calculated. Everything said, this is real, but the ground-based radar showed nothing. Soviet doctrine used layered detection. Satellites spotted the launch. Ground radar confirmed it during mid-flight. The two systems backed each other up, except now the satellites would screamed, attack. The radar showed clear sky. Petrov checked the data again. The satellites were functioning. No malfunction indicators. The system genuinely detected 5 launches. Standard procedure, trust the satellites. They were designed for exactly this. Infrared detection from space, far more reliable than ground radar at detecting the initial launch. But 5G missiles. Petrov's mind ran the scenarios. If America launched a nuclear first strike, they'd use everything. Thousands of warheads. Coordinated strikes on Soviet command bunkers, missile silos, air bases. Decapitation. Total surprise. Maximum damage before the Soviets could respond. That's what American nuclear war plans called for. Petrov knew this. Everyone at Serpukhov 15 knew this. 5 missiles couldn't accomplish that. 5 missiles might destroy 5 targets, but they'd leave the Soviet arsenal intact, capable of total retaliation. No American war planner would order a 5-missile strike. It made no sense. Unless it was a test. A probe. Launch a few missiles, see how Soviet early warning responded. But that made even less sense. You don't probe with nuclear weapons. Or maybe the satellites detected something else. A malfunction. A go signal. The ground radar still showed nothing. Petrov looked at the elapsed time. 3 minutes since the first alarm. The communications officer was waiting for orders. Regulations said call it in, immediately. Every second of delay gave the Americans more advantage. The officers around him were watching. This was his decision, his responsibility. He thought about the technology. The OCO system was new, barely months operational. There had been bugs, software issues, calibration problems. This could be another one. But if it wasn't, if those missiles were real, his delay could cost millions of Soviet lives. Petrov made his choice. It's a false alarm, he said. Don't report it. The officer stared at him. The regulations were absolute. A satellite detection meant immediate reporting. It's a malfunction, Petrov insisted. The radar shows nothing. 5 missiles make no sense. It's the satellites. He picked up the phone to military command, reported the alarm, but classified it as a system malfunction, not an attack. This distinction mattered. An attack report triggered the nuclear response chain. A malfunction report meant investigate further. Petrov bet everything on that distinction. For 8 agonizing minutes, the bunker watched the screens. If the missiles were real, they'd appear on ground radar soon. The satellites tracked them across the Atlantic. Time to impact counting down. Nothing. The radar stayed clear. No missiles appeared in mid-flight. The satellite tracks continued for several more minutes, then vanished. Petrov exhaled. He was right. The satellites had malfunctioned. 5 Phantom missiles, ghost signals, but he didn't know why. Not yet. The investigation took weeks. Soviet technicians tore apart the OCO system's data. They found the cause. Sunlight. On September 26, 1983, at exactly 12:14 a.m., Moscow time, the sun was positioned at a specific angle relative to OCO satellite number 7. High-altitude clouds over the northern United States reflected sunlight directly into the satellite's infrared sensors. The sensors detected bright infrared signatures, exactly like ICBM exhaust plumes. The computer interpreted the signals as missile launches. It calculated trajectories based on the infrared bloom's position, generated target tracks, sounded the alarm. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It detected infrared light and assumed missiles. It was wrong. The engineers called it a rare alignment. The satellites were in Molniya orbits, highly elliptical paths that spent most of their time high above the northern hemisphere. At certain times of year, at certain angles, sunlight reflecting off clouds could mimic launch signatures. Nobody had anticipated this during testing. The system went operational without catching the flaw. September 26th happened to be the autumn equinox. The sun was positioned perfectly to create the false signal. pure chance. If Petrov hadn't been on duty that night, someone else would have made the call. Someone who might have followed protocol exactly, reported an attack, triggered the launch sequence. The Soviet strategic rocket forces had approximately 10,000 nuclear warheads in 1983. Missiles on high alert, bombers ready to launch, submarine crews at sea. Launch on warning meant exactly that. Detection equals launch. Fire before the enemy's missiles arrive, because once American warheads started detonating, Soviet command and control might be destroyed. Unable to give the launch order. Launch on warning was insurance, mutual assured destruction. You launch at us, we launch at you, everyone dies. If Petrov had called in an attack, the strategic rocket forces would have begun launching within 8 minutes. Procedures were automatic. The early warning data would go up the chain to Soviet military command. They'd wake up General Secretary Andropov, present the evidence. And Andropov, sick, paranoid, convinced the Americans were planning a first strike, would almost certainly have ordered retaliation. Soviet missiles lifting off from silos across Siberia and Central Asia, SLBMs launching from submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific, bombers scrambling from air bases. American early warning would detect the Soviet launches within 90 seconds. NORAD would alert the president. The American nuclear response would launch immediately. Within 30 minutes, thousands of nuclear warheads would be in flight. No stopping them, no calling them back. Within an hour, every major city in the Northern Hemisphere would be burning. The death toll, estimated 100 to 200 million in the first 24 hours. Nuclear winter following, global temperature drop, crop failures worldwide, starvation, disease, civilization ending, all because sunlight hit clouds at the wrong angle, and because one officer decided to trust his gut over the computer. Petrov saved the world, but the Soviet military didn't see it that way. The investigation concluded the OCO system had malfunctioned. Petrov's assessment was correct, but there was a problem. Petrov hadn't followed procedure. He'd delayed reporting the alarm, made a judgment call that violated standing orders, and his written report of the incident was incomplete. He hadn't documented the full sequence of events with proper detail. Soviet military bureaucracy didn't reward initiative. It punished deviation from procedure. Petrov received a reprimand, not a commendation, a reprimand for incomplete reporting. The incident was classified, top secret. Petrov was forbidden from discussing it. His superiors wanted it buried. The embarrassment was too great. The system had failed. Petrov had prevented disaster by ignoring orders. None of it looked good. Instead of a medal, Petrov got silence. His career trajectory shifted. No more promotions, no recognition. In 1984, Petrov left the military. He took a job at the research institute that developed the OCO system. Quiet work, low profile. He was 45 years old. His career effectively over, all because he'd saved the world. Petrov married Raisa in 1973. They had 2 children, son Dmitry, daughter Yelena. Raisa never knew about September 26th. The incident was classified. Petrov couldn't tell her. He carried the secret alone. In the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the incident was declassified. Petrov could finally talk about it. By then, his wife was dying. Raisa was diagnosed with cancer. Petrov took early retirement from the research institute to care for her. They lived on his small Soviet military pension. Money was tight. Raisa died in 1997. She'd learned about September 26th only in her final years. The magnitude of what her husband had done. The burden he'd carried silently for over a decade. Petrov lived alone after that. A small apartment in Fryazino, a Moscow suburb. Modest pension. Occasional interviews with journalists who were starting to learn the story. But Petrov wasn't comfortable with the attention. He insisted he was just doing his job. Making a judgment call. Not heroism. Just analysis. I was only 50-50, he told interviewers. I didn't know if it was real or not. I just thought 5 missiles made no sense. The West discovered his story in the late 1990s. Arms control advocates began calling him the man who saved the world. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens, a San Francisco-based group, gave Petrov its World Citizen Award, a trophy and 1,000. Recognition from strangers on the other side of the world. In 2006, he received another World Citizen Award, this time at the United Nations in New York. Petrov traveled to America, the country he'd been trained to see as the enemy, the country whose missiles he'd almost reported as incoming. They gave him a standing ovation. February 17th, 2013, Dresden, Germany. Petrov, now 73, received the Dresden Prize, a peace award worth 25,000 euros, about $32,000, presented at a ceremony in the Semper Opera House. Finally, 30 years later, recognition. But the Russian government? Silence. No award, no acknowledgement. Moscow didn't want to admit how close they'd come, how a single officer's insubordination had prevented Armageddon. Petrov lived quietly in retirement. He gave occasional interviews, participated in a documentary film, The Man Who Saved the World, released in 2014. But mostly he stayed home, alone, modest pension, small apartment. His son Dmitry later said his father never sought attention, never wanted to be famous. He'd made a decision in 8 minutes that saved hundreds of millions of lives. But to Petrov, it was just analysis, just work. On May 19th, 2017, Stanislav Petrov died of pneumonia. He was 77 years old. For 4 months, nobody outside his immediate family knew. He died alone in his apartment. No announcement. No obituary. It wasn't until September 2017 that the news broke. A family friend mentioned it to journalists. Suddenly the world learned. The man who saved the world was dead, had been dead for months. His death went unnoticed for as long as he'd lived in obscurity after saving civilization. Petrov is survived by his son Dmitry, his daughter Yelena, and 2 grandchildren. He's buried in a cemetery outside Moscow. No state funeral, no military honors. Just a quiet grave for a quiet man. But here's what matters. September 26th, 1983. Wasn't the only close call that autumn. November 2nd, 11th, 1983. Less than 6 weeks after Petrov's decision, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command post exercise, war game simulating NATO nuclear release procedures, practicing what would happen if the Cold War went hot. But the Soviets didn't know it was just an exercise. NATO kept Able Archer realistic. They used authentic nuclear release codes. They simulated the procedures for authorizing nuclear strikes. Radio traffic sounded exactly like real preparations for nuclear war. The KGB, already paranoid from Operation Ryan, detected the activity. They saw NATO forces going on alert, saw communications that matched pre-war preparations, saw exercises that looked identical to the cover for a first strike. And Soviet military intelligence concluded, this is it. NATO is attacking under the cover of an exercise. The Soviet Union went on nuclear alert. The 4th Air Army in East Germany and Poland began loading nuclear warheads onto combat aircraft. Bomber crews received targeting packages. Missile forces increased readiness. The Soviet Union was preparing to launch a preemptive nuclear strike. They genuinely believed NATO was about to attack. The evidence, all of it false, seemed overwhelming. It was Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz, American intelligence officer assigned to NATO, who recognized something was wrong. He saw Soviet forces mobilizing, alerted his superiors, recommended NATO de-escalate the exercise. NATO command realized the Soviets were genuinely alarmed. They dialed back Able Archer, made it clear it was just an exercise. The Soviet alert ended. Forces stood down. How close was it? Declassified documents from 2015 show the Soviets had begun preparations for immediate use of nuclear weapons. Not just alert, actual preparation to launch. If NATO had continued the exercise one more day, Soviet leadership might have decided the threat was real, ordered the strike. Twice in 6 weeks, the world almost ended. September 26th, false alarm from satellites. November 7th, false alarm from Wargame. Both times, someone recognized the signals were wrong, made the call to stand down, prevented the launch. 1983 was the closest the world came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some historians argue it was closer. At least during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides knew they were in a crisis. In 1983, the danger came from misunderstanding. False signals. Systems designed to prevent war nearly causing it. Stanislav Petrov's legacy is complicated. The Russian government never officially recognized what he did. No state honor, no acknowledgement. To admit Petrov's story is to admit how fragile nuclear command and control really is, how close the Soviet Union came to launching based on a false alarm. That's not a story Moscow wants told, but the rest of the world remembers. Arms control organizations cite Petrov as evidence that launch on warning is too dangerous, that human judgment is necessary in the nuclear chain, that computer systems alone can't be trusted. At the United Nations, September 26th has been unofficially recognized as Nuclear Abolition Day, commemorating the day Petrov prevented nuclear war, a reminder of how close civilization came to ending. Intelligence agencies study the incident. It's taught at military colleges, at nuclear policy seminars, at strategic command courses. The case study is mandatory. What happens when early warning systems fail, when technology gives false data, when procedures demand action but instinct says wait? Petrov represents the human element in nuclear deterrence. The person who has to make the call, who carries the weight of that decision for the rest of their life. He was 50-50 on whether the alarm was real. A coin flip, gut instinct versus computer data. He chose instinct, and the world survived. But here's what haunts the analysts who study Petrov's decision. What if he'd been wrong? What if those 5 missiles had been real? What if it was a limited strike and his delay allowed them to detonate before Soviet retaliation began? Petrov would have been executed, and millions of Soviets would have died. The decision was impossible. Damned either way. Trust the system or trust your gut. Follow orders or break them. Launch and kill millions, or wait and potentially allow millions to die. No training prepares you for that. No protocol covers it. Petrov made the call in 8 minutes with incomplete information and the fate of civilization in his hands. He happened to be right, but the terrifying truth is, he didn't know. He admitted it. 50-50. Flip a coin, and the coin came up right. That's how close the world came to ending. A guess, an instinct, 8 minutes of judgment. Today, the nuclear arsenals remain. Thousands of warheads on high alert. Early warning systems still watching. The technology has improved. The OCO satellites have been replaced. New systems, better sensors, more processing power. But the fundamental problem remains unchanged. Detect a launch. Decide, real or false alarm. Minutes to choose. Civilization at stake. Launch on warning is still doctrine. Russia maintains it. The United States officially denies it but likely retains the capability. The reason is simple. If you wait for confirmation, the enemy's warheads might destroy your ability to respond. Launch on warning is insurance, but it's also risk. Massive, existential risk. Risk that a false alarm, technical glitch, natural phenomenon, human error triggers the launch sequence before anyone realizes it's wrong. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov broke the chain, violated procedure, delayed reporting, trusted instinct over data. Today's officers face the same impossible choice. If the alarm sounds, what do? How certain do you need to be? How much time do you have? 8 minutes, maybe less. The weapons are faster now. The system's more complex. The stakes unchanged. Petrov's decision remains relevant because the danger didn't end in 1983. It's still there, dormant, waiting for the false alarm that someone doesn't catch in time. On September 26, 2013, the 30th anniversary of the incident, memorial services were held in Dresden, in Washington, in Moscow. Petrov attended some. Quiet ceremonies, peace activists and arms control advocates, remembering the day that didn't end the world. Petrov spoke briefly. He repeated what he'd always said. He was just doing his job. He made an assessment. He got lucky. I didn't feel like a hero, he told the audience. I was frightened. The responsibility was enormous, but I had to make a decision. That's the story. Not heroism, not certainty, just a frightened officer in a bunker making a judgment call with the world at stake. And somehow, impossibly, getting it right. The irony is brutal. Petrov saved more lives than anyone in human history, prevented nuclear war, stopped Armageddon. He received a reprimand, died alone in a small apartment on a military pension, went unnoticed for 4 months after his death. The people he saved never knew his name until years later. Most still don't. That's the reality of nuclear deterrence. The officers who maintain it, who make the impossible decisions, who carry the weight of extinction protocols, they do it in silence, in classified bunkers, under protocols that forbid discussing what they do. Petrov's story only became public because the Soviet Union collapsed, because the files were declassified, because journalists found him. How many others are there? How many close calls happened that we don't know about? How many officers made similar decisions that prevented disaster? We don't know. We likely never will. But we know about Stanislav Petrov. We know that on September 26, 1983, at 12:14 a.m. Moscow time, the world came within 8 minutes of nuclear war. And we know one man stopped it. Not with weapons, not with strategy, not with orders or protocol, with judgment, with instinct, with 8 minutes of terrified analysis and a 50-50 guess that happened to be right. 5 missiles showed on the screen. He decided they weren't there. And they weren't. That's why we tell this story. Not to celebrate heroism. Petrov wouldn't want that. But to remember how fragile this all is. How close we've come. How much depends on individual judgment in moments of crisis. The nuclear arsenals are still there. The early warning system still watching. The procedures still in place. And somewhere, right now, officers are on duty, watching screens, waiting for alarms that might sound, hoping they never have to make Petrov's choice, hoping that if they do, they get it right, because there are no second chances, no appeals, no time to reconsider. 8 minutes, one decision, everything at stake. Stanislav Petrov made that call, and the world survived. Remember him. Remember September 26th, 1983. Remember how close it came. And remember that the danger didn't end when Petrov made his decision. It's still there, still waiting, still depending on human judgment in the face of impossible choices. If this story matters to you, do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Stories like this don't get told unless people like you make them visible. Hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We're pulling stories like this from declassified archives, historical records, and forgotten moments every single week. Real decisions, real consequences, real people who held civilization's fate in their hands. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you'd heard of Stanislav Petrov before this video. Tell me if this changes how you think about nuclear weapons. Or just type September 26th so we know you're here remembering. You're not just a viewer. You're part of making sure Stanislav Petrov isn't forgotten. You're part of making sure the next generation understands how close we came. How much depended on 8 minutes of judgment in a bunker beneath Moscow. Share this video. Text it to someone who needs to hear this story. Post it, tweet it, whatever. This story deserves a bigger audience than it has. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering September 26, 1983. Thank you for honoring the man who saved the world by trusting his gut when the computer said launch. These weren't abstract calculations. This was human judgment against extinction. You're helping us make sure that judgment and that choice stays remembered. See you in the next story.